Welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Lucier and I am the training director with Waterkeeper Alliance. I work near the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia rivers on the traditional lands of the Cowlitz people. I'm very excited to have all of you here today for our presentation on storytelling for building power. We have with us our fabulous presenter, Stiv Wilson, who is the creator of The Story of Plastic. If you have not yet seen that documentary, I highly recommend that you do watch it. He is also the co-director of the Peak Plastic Foundation. And with that, Stiv, the floor is yours. You are on mute.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Stiv Wilson. And as mentioned, I am the co-director of Peak Plastic Foundation and creator, partial director, producer, writer, lead bottle washer of The Story of Plastic. And, I want to start out talking about where The Story of Plastic came from. Less from a personal standpoint, but more from a strategic standpoint. So my background is, well, I'm an aesthetic philosopher, which means I studied in beauty in college, which is a wonderful way of saying, how are you going to get a job when you get out? But I can tell you what's pretty and what's not, for sure. And that's actually how I got into the plastics issue, is seeing plastic in the environment was incongruent to the natural order. It was other. And the color, the shape, the texture, there was something inside of me innately that knew that it shouldn't be where it was in the environment. It was that whether that is part nature, part nurture, that's a whole argument we can get into for hours in a philosophical discussion. But ultimately, I'd been working on this issue for 10 years and went from local campaigning. In the first campaign I did was plastic bag ban in Portland, Oregon with the Surf Rider chapter. Also worked with waterkeepers on that, by the way, Tualatin Waterkeeper and Columbia River Waterkeeper as well, which is cool. You guys have always been there to back up, which is great. Well, and also lead, but in my experience, back up. But why I wanted to make The Story of Plastic is I had been looking at this issue from a waste perspective, a water perspective, a biodiversity perspective. And I started understanding the human rights aspects of waste, as well as production. And when I looked at the landscape of advocacy, I realized that people working in disparate parts of the system, the left hand was not talking to the right. So I wanted to create a systemic overview of the plastics issue, which I think you can overlay onto many different advocacy issues because they are systemic. Whether it's consumerism, whether it's water pollution, it's where does it come from, who's effective, and where does it go? Now, one of the biggest problems we have in the advocacy community is our notion of scarcity. So we are consistently looking for more money or trying to gear our programming and our ideas to a small budget or inability to really go broad scale. I recognized in my work that this sort of approach to communications wasn't working. And it wasn't getting past sort of the bubble or the choir. And especially in a world of social media that is governed by curated algorithms for whatever viewer or person is on it, you're really not able to get to other folks, with the exception of when you pay for it. So I don't know if any of you followed the Lincoln Project during the election at all. But those films that were put out in social media garnered millions and millions and millions of views and lots of engagement. They also had a $16 million marketing budget, which is way outside of what any sort of war chest any of us are ever going to have to do our work. That said, it is having the tenacity and the abundance mindset that made Story of Plastic and made it universal and get it to scale, to get it to Discovery Network. And I would like to say I'm an Emmy award-winning filmmaker who is not a filmmaker by trade. I look at film as a vehicle, and what I'm trying to do is mimic the medium that people engage with now. You know, in our silos of the nonprofit world, we are often sort of talking to each other. And often, even in our personal relationships, we are not being super intersectional activists, birds of a flock, you know, band together. And so activists tend to gather together. And even in romantic relationships, we often choose a partner who is part of the advocacy world or is has a similar worldview. The problem with that is that the vast majority of the general public is not like that. They don't engage with these issues in the way we do, and they don't see the sort of facts that we are coming across every day, the reports, the policies. So they don't have the sort of orientation that we do, and that is paramount to remember with the audience you're speaking to, that they don't understand the minutia, not because they're incapable of it. It's just, if you're not a brain surgeon, you don't understand brain surgery. And so coming with our advocacy work, we have been trained in a way that we don't necessarily recognize, but we sort of take for granted. And the vast majority of the public doesn't do that. So all this is to say, we formed Peak Plastic Foundation to start trying to meet the message at the medium that people understand, telling stories at scale, and also doing it. And when I say at scale, I mean HBO, Netflix, Amazon Prime, these kind of things, where millions and millions of people can see it. And the strategic goals is to shift the narrative around what this issue actually is and who it affects, and to center voices of the most harmed at the center of the narrative, because this is where we're able to create empathy. And this is where we're able to build intersections to bring people in. So what we do, very simply, is we subsidize our own salaries and raise money to build productions for groups that do not have the ability to do it themselves from a resource standpoint, not from a acumen standpoint. And so in our expressed goal is creating a bridge to bring frontline and grassroots groups into the conversation to set the table, not just sit at the table, but set the table. And so I want to show you an example. I'm going to share my screen here of a film we made that was campaign aligned for the federal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And then I want to analyze it a little bit to get at some of these concepts I'm talking about. So here we go.
On the other hand, for African Americans, conditions worsen with the plants moving closer and closer to where the Black community was.
You can't fish in that river anymore. We can't even grow a decent garden anymore. My neighbor on my right side died. The neighbor on my left side died. How many more have to die? The plastic that we use in our everyday life, the chemicals that's used to make those items are being emitted in the air, and we're breathing that. Come and see. Come and breathe this air. I bet you any money you're gonna leave here with a headache or a stomach ache. The people that we elected in office, they let us down from way back.
What happened in Louisiana was a really tragic story in terms of who benefits and who bears the burden of petrochemicals.
The majority of trash incinerators in the country are located in communities of color and low-income communities because there is a lack of power to push back against them. Baltimore's largest air polluter is its trash incinerator. There's a ton of plastic going there every day, contributing to heart disease, stroke, chronic respiratory diseases, cancers.
I've been living here for like 17 years.
Okay.
I've been encountering a lot of people that's been passing away from cancer. My brother just died from cancer. My neighbors, a lot of people.
The actions of the petrochemical industry were basically allowed because of really racist policies, ingrained policies, and decision making. Everybody has, to some extent, accepted it as normal. This is not normal.
Indonesia is a major dumping ground for US waste. Sampah yang kotor dan tidak dapat didaur ulang dibakar secara terbuka. Pemerintah Amerika Serikat harus bertanggung jawab atas sampah plastik di Indonesia dan negara berkembang lainnya.
We're hiding it, we're dumping it in the ocean, we're shipping it overseas, we're putting it into incinerators, we're polluting the planet, and we're using more and more carbon. Plastic is killing us all, and it's not killing us equally.
Plastic production and waste is fanning the flames of climate chaos. It's poisoning our air, our water, our soil. It's a monumental problem that disproportionately impacts Black and brown and low-income communities. And the problem's getting bigger and more complicated every single year. In the next 3 decades, global plastic production is expected to triple.
And the people that are making the most money from this are not assuming the responsibility.
The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is the bold, comprehensive national strategy to address this enormous challenge. This bill includes a pause on new plastic production facilities. It bans non-recyclable, single-use plastic products. It requires big corporations to take responsibility for the pollution that their plastic creates. We can spur massive investments in domestic recycling and composting infrastructure and create good-paying American jobs.
These legislative policies that would move us towards zero waste, that is a critical piece of the justice that we need.
I want St. James to be rebuilt. We could sit at the table and find something that can bring in jobs where it's not dealing with so many industrial pollutants.
It's going to take real leadership that understands that you can create 10 times as many jobs from going to a zero waste economy that composts, that recycles, that reuses, that redesigns, that creates more repair shops and centers them in communities of color, in low-income communities. We would be able to create such an economic boom.
I want our grandchildren to grow up with clean air, clean water, clean soil. Give us back our life. Give us back our livelihood.
We can decide to just hang around with oil and gas and go down with it, or we can wake up and get on board with the future. When you lift up people at the bottom, you lift up everybody. I believe that we are on the road to make really deep changes in our system and to move forward with a new concept of humanity.
Okay, so what I would like to do is talk about what our strategy behind this film is and what our strategy is for how we engage in the advocacy work that we work on in our sort of issue vertical. So there's a number of things that are working in our film called Breathe This Air, which are different than typical storytelling or campaign videos. One, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is comprehensive from downstream to upstream. However, the voices that are heard from most on this issue are downstream voices. They're voices that have traditionally been resourced and typically are more privileged or wealthier NGOs. So they tend to be able to set the narrative frame. And that, to us, is a pretty serious problem as far as intersectionality is concerned and actually creating policy that solves the issue that we're working to solve. So our take on this film was to center environmental justice voices because there's aspects of the bill that speak directly to the change that these communities are asking for. And we brought them into the consulting process to develop those pieces of the policy. And by taking our film and not looking to like talk about like what is in the Break Free from Plastic Pollution bill, but rather what is the real harm that the status quo is doing and who are the most affected people, we get to see what this is actually like in real time. What does this pollution create? What sort of problems does it create for people on the front lines? Because to our mind, if folks who are the most harmed are not negotiating the policy that is meant to solve their problems, the policy is ultimately not going to reflect their wishes. And negotiating a policy, if you are not somebody who is being harmed, you are more likely to give away aspects of that policy that somebody at the front line wouldn't. So to us, it's very important to center those voices in our storytelling and create an opportunity for those voices to be heard at scale and participate in the process. We have an equity problem in the United States. We have an equity problem in the NGO space. We have an equity problem in the corporate space. It is a societal equity problem. Our job as advocates who are ushering in the new world is to create these intersections. And that's what the purpose of our film work is. Now, a couple things I want to sort of drill further down in sort of like how we look at building power. So the effect of this film was, one, Sharon Levine, who is the woman in the beginning of the film, talking about her experience. She also, in Cancer Alley, she also led the No Formosa campaign to success, which was massive. She's an 80-year-old grandmother who's never been an activist before, but her authenticity and her lived experience is what ultimately sparked that campaign and sparked the attention to it, because she was a different voice than what we're typically hearing, a more authentic voice. The effect of that is she has now met with Jill Biden. She was able to get the EPA into Cancer Alley. Now, let's be clear, like there's still a long way to go beyond Formosa and shifting regulations. But now she has a seat at the table and a commanding voice in a system where she didn't have one before. The reason we find this ultimately strategic is when we look at the people who care about the things we do, what we recognize is there are people who care about the things we do, but in a different way. So I lived on a sailboat for 6 years. It's named Nurdle. It was, which is a pre-production plastic pellet. I went to the gyres. I studied plastics in the ocean. I was part of the whole community that brought this issue to the forefront. But that's a pretty monolithic kind of group of people. And it's largely white, it's largely privileged, and it's largely coastal. The problem with that is there is not enough power in that constituency, regardless of the equity issues, to actually create transformative change. As we investigated the system more, we recognized that there were many voices that we were not hearing from who were affected in a more existential way. So by building media and telling stories that put us all together, we create a de facto movement out of that film. So for us, when I say I'm not a filmmaker, film is a tactic in a broader strategy. It is the hearth. It is the convening place for groups to get together, to understand each other from disparate walks of life, because everybody seeing that film will see themselves in it in some way or shape or form. Whether you're looking at a legislator, Jeff Merkley, you may identify with him, or you may identify with somebody like Sharon. The other layer is the Dr. Beverly Wright from Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. She sort of represents the academic in that space. So we have community organizer, academic, elected. That's sort of the formula of it. And by placing them all together, we are placing them in a dialogue and a conversation that will extend beyond the film. So how does this have an effect? Now, it's not always one-to-one. I can't say you make a film and you change the world. Obviously, that doesn't happen. In this case, however, this brought the attention of the Formosa fight to a broader federal political body. This also infected the regulatory agencies that were looking at the permit for this. And what we were able to get is a strong environmental impact assessment that ultimately, if that's carried out in the way it should be, the plant will never be built. So the expectation is the plant is going to move out. But our film created the necessary intersections for people to organize, build the power to push back on that. And I also want to be very clear, it's not only our film that did that, but it was piece of a broader suite of tactics. So as we move forward in this work, our next film we're working on is called Goliath is Wobbling, because we actually believe the fossil fuel industry is on its last foot and is ready to be toppled. We'll be looking at the petrochemical experience of people along the Gulf Coast and the Ohio River Valley in another feature-length documentary. What we're doing again is bringing that to a broader scale. It has a significantly higher budget, and it will reach significantly more people. And the goal of that is to frame the narrative around this that the media will respond to, and then legislators. So that is tactically how we look at it. And the other great benefit of this from an equity standpoint is the subjects we tend to work with in our films are benefit from a resource standpoint from being in them and helping us make them, because it creates amplification, which creates attention, which creates resource mobilization. So our express goal at Peak Plastic Foundation is not to be a brand in and of ourselves. Our goal is to add value to other people's work that are trying to push for a significant transformative change. And we find that that sort of capacity building is sort of like a lucky accident of building the film, but it can be repeated over and over again. That same accident ultimately occurs. So the other thing I want to draw attention to is that notion of branding. So in the nonprofit space, the NGO space, we are always fighting to exist. We are always writing grants. We are always counting pennies, to get to the next place. So when we bring our content forward to the world, we tend to brand it in the way that the sort of for-profit world does. And we try and get other people to share our work. Well, unfortunately, as human nature is, nonprofits competed against each other for resources. And there's a sense of resource scarcity. Executive directors do not want to talk about who their funders are to other executive directors. Some are different than that, but generally that is sort of your currency, and that's how you sort of keep the lights on in your own organization. We took a radically different approach to an NGO. We are totally project-based, so there's only 2 full-time employees, and everybody else is hired on. That's not translatable to most NGOs. What is translatable is letting go of the territorial nature of our content. So if you look at the end of that film, you saw 132 logos. Well, I'm sure no one counted them, and if you did, you shouldn't be working at the job you are now. You should be at NASA or something. But the point is we said when we were deploying this to all these groups, do you want to put your logo on it? You can take a rough cut. What that did in effect is get 132 organizations willing to distribute the content because they felt ownership of it. They felt invested in it. They didn't feel like they were promoting Peak Plastic Foundation. What they felt is they were promoting a campaign film that they have endorsed, that they have their name and logo on, that they can then use and embed natively. And when I say embed natively, meaning on Facebook, they don't need to share Peak Plastics video. They can upload it to their own Facebook. So we are never asking their audience to navigate away from them, which is huge as far as getting over the barrier to us having a common and collective voice. And so when a legislator sees that film, sure, they feel it. They see that, they see Merkley alongside a community activist. They see them tantamount or equated, which is elevating one and bringing the other to the same level, which is totally important for demonstrating authority and knowledge over a specific issue. But also, what ultimately occurred is we were able to get this to, I don't even know the metrics offhand, but millions of views on a social media channel, which is nearly impossible without paid advertising at this time. And we did it by simply stepping back. And that is, I think, a lesson for all of us. And that is an abundance sort of vantage versus a scarcity vantage. I am a sailor. I grew up sailing. I firmly believe in the saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's what we try and create from a Peak Plastic standpoint, is we try to create that tide and we try and curate it so that all boats can lift. And that is ultimately our approach to storytelling. And we think that's what's needed. We think people need to dream bigger. We think people need to get past the idea that NGOs are constantly rubbing 2 pennies together. I've been able in 6 months to raise $750,000 towards this next film. Why? Because we are telling the funders we are doing something different. I'm not going to lie, it helps that Story of Plastic won an Emmy, for sure. But that is not the only reason, because we made Story of Plastic from the same vantage. And I was going out fundraising and saying, hey, I've never made a film. Will you give me tons of money to make film? And so that was a that was a harder value proposition at the time. But the good news is that positional power we gained from the critical acclaim of our first film, we are able to leverage for our second. But the cool thing about it is our second film, Goliath is Wobbling, just like Story of Plastic, is not meant to be owned by us. It's meant to be owned by the people in it. It's meant to be organized by the people in it. It's meant to live as their living history and something that they can create events around, organize around, bring funders, panels, etc. And one of the most delightful aspects of the Story of Plastic, when I watched it deploy out through the world, which I couldn't even track anymore, was at the end, almost every NGO had some sort of panel discussion afterwards. the people who populated those panels were not speaking directly to the film. They were speaking about issues similar to them that are affected in their geography. And so they were able to mobilize, bring people in, and build power around that film. So I really appreciate the chance to share sort of our strategy and our thinking around this. We do think it's, it's needed in the space, and we hope people copy it and do it. And it ultimately, it has great effect. I can say confidently that the story of plastic film changed how almost every NGO views the plastic issue, and it changed their work plans on how to engage with it. Now, I won't take credit for that. What I will take credit for is knowing that if we amplify the right voices and curate them together, we create the kind of story that transcends petty human territorial nature or scarcity nature or whatever. And that's what we do. The stories in it are the brilliance, the genius in that film is from the people's mouths speaking. It's not from us. And so, but our smart idea was to put it together. And I think ultimately that's the kind of approach we need to take to storytelling to build transformative power. So thank you. I know we have about 20 minutes left, and I would love to get into this a bit. I think it's a small enough group. Catherine, however you want to moderate or whatever, I'm cool with. But yeah, I would love to talk to people and get some sort of impressions.
Yeah, excellent. First of all, thank you so much, Stiv, because you so beautifully demonstrated why this movement will not succeed if we do not integrate the principles of justice, equity, and diversity. So thank you so much for that. It is not mission drift. It is imperative that we do the work. I would like to invite people to comment and or ask questions. Again, you can raise your hand and unmute. You can chat, share thoughts. I know that thread of what I call ego terrorism that we suffer from in the conservation movement is so prevalent, and I wish we could figure out how to overcome that. But please take this opportunity to ask questions and share.
Martin has a hand up, it looks like.
Yeah, go for it, Martin.
Hey there. Really interesting presentation. I like a lot of what you're talking about. The question I have is, so I'm working in rural northeastern Oklahoma. We have a Superfund site. We have flooding issues. We have lead poisoning, global warming, on and on and on. Right, same as a lot of folks here, I think. But we're also pretty removed from political centers of power, right? We're an hour and a half from Tulsa. We're 4 hours from Kansas City. We're 2.5 hours from the Bentonville, Arkansas area, right? And so what we have here, engaging in a little bit of a stereotype for simplicity's sake, is a community where political decision makers may not always welcome a wider audience paying attention and speaking up on issues that are local to us, as opposed to some of the national issues, right? Because you can look at this story as a national and international concern with plastics, but you can also view it as a local problem with local regulatory decisions. So do you have any thoughts about how you might scale this down, right? Scale it down for that sort of hyper-local, what can we take if going national and getting a lot of attention might not be helpful for the local aspects of these problems?
That's a really good question. And I think, it's going to be a case-by-case answer, but if I can sort of generally answer it, and I'm speaking off the cuff here, but I think the best advice is we find that the local story is actually the one that universalizes to the state or federal consciousness, So it is the particular local story. How we create the like systemic understanding of it is we take 2, 3, 4 local stories and juxtapose where thematically the villain is the same and the problem is the same. And oftentimes the solution is the same. So that builds power. But how do you reverse engineer that down to the local side? Here's what I can say is storytelling work does not have to, it can be confined to the audience you're looking to impact, mobilize, etc. So we do know that like I went to college in a small town. I grew up in a big town, but I know from living the sort of small town life is any sort of incidents of a citizen of that place being elevated or recorded or whatever, and then showcased back to that community helps build capacity, confidence, and power in that individual. And so that to me is, I think, what you're looking for is to build a story around somebody or a couple of people from that community that exemplifies the community and helps to create an organizing structure within the community. And then from a distribution standpoint, you shift that, you shift to who your distribution partners are. Might be a church, it might like I know in a lot of small town campaigns or whatever, we do flyers, put flyers in windows that say, we are a business that supports XYZ. The next step there is to have them be a distributor of the media you're creating. And so that everybody in the town starts seeing themselves or people like them, and they feel like part of a broader sense of power. Because we know that, like, one of my favorite sort of proverbs comes from Chief Tecumseh, and he, did this exercise where he would pass out a bunch of sticks to a warrior, and the warriors, and would ask the warriors to break the stick, and they would sort of laugh and break the stick in half. Then he would hand out a bundle of sticks, and he could not get a single warrior to be able to break the entire bundle. So what that says is the power of collective, right? That's the metaphor that he's employing. You have to create the spark to create the power of the collective. And so I think that's possible to do at the local level as well. And certainly I know from like the stuff we're shooting of Sharon Levine in St. James Parish Cancer Alley, we've given her short clips and cuts that she's using at her church, well, it's pretty much her church, to be honest. That is the community center of her life, and that is the orientation of the community. But that helps to create power within the community. I hope I answered that question well, because I think what I gave you was my best sense of theory on how to do that without having fully ground truthed it. But my sense is if you can engineer it one way, you can engineer it the other.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do, particularly featuring local people and that resonance that local voices have within the community. I think it feels right to me as well. So yeah, thank you. Thanks
for the question.
Myra, would you like to ask your question or comment?
Thank you. I'm trying to understand your production because you covered a great deal of, you covered the story. And I'm curious as to how much pre-production planning of storyline went into the script. Were you working from the script, or did this just grow organically?
It's a good question. So scripting in a documentary is kind of a funny thing. What we do is we transcribe every interview. So everybody in that film you saw that I showed, minus Lowenthal and Merkley. I mean, these guys talk from talking points always. They never go off book for the most part, electeds. But for all the like sort of community level or NGO level folks in that film, it's about an hour and a half interview, and then we transcribe it. We have software that transcribes it. Then we highlight it. We highlight where the themes we're going, we let the themes emerge organically, then we curate the themes together, and that becomes the script. Obviously, going into it from a pre-production standpoint, most of what we have to do is not about trying to figure out what the story is, because anybody who reads an article in a national newspaper about Cancer Alley should understand a few basic things. One, an insane amount of pollution disproportionately affects Black people. I mean, it's Black people in Cancer Alley, and it's massive. It's a David Goliath story. You know, obviously there's massive economic interest, small community fighting back, David versus Goliath. So we knew the general themes of the area. So the real work goes into trust building. So anytime we shoot, we come first on a research trip. Typically, we will shoot some when we do this. Well, but we don't bring a full camera crew. We go out to lunch, we visit the church, we go to their house, we have tea, we really explained our theory of change and how we want to collaborate with these folks versus extract from them. In almost every experience, we are dealing with people who are fighting the problems of fossil fuel extraction, and often NGOs and filmmakers are coming in and extracting from them and then showing their film and leaving. We have a long-tailed engagement. We get into text message relationships with the subjects of our films. So that's the biggest pre-production work. And broader film work, there's a ton of research that goes into data, facts, and visualizing that data in a way that people can ultimately consume. But from a getting to the intimacy of the character standpoint, that's all based on trust relationships and reputation. So we have a good reputation in the space, but still, you got to get in there. You got to look at somebody eye to eye. And honestly, it kind of blows my mind with, I'm from Minneapolis. I was deeply affected by the George Floyd murder. It was very close to where I grew up. And what blows my mind in the NGO space is I can't even tell you how many times people, I've been working on a bill in a legislature and somebody's like, we need a person of color to testify at this committee. And we say that as if that's okay, and I'm like, well, why wasn't the person at the table when we formed the policy? That's how we actually get investment by, groups that are not like us. So point being is you have to build the trust, and it's not as hard. You don't have to read 20 million books on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What you need to do is show up and listen and shut the heck up.
Thank you, Stiv, and thanks, Myra, for the question. We do have a little bit more time if anybody else would like to ask a question or make a comment.
I have a question, I guess a comment. I think every one of our organizations here has something in common. We all have really powerful stories in our watershed. And I get the sense that most of us probably lack the resources or technical know-how to produce a professional film like the ones that you create, Stiv. So kind of looking back and reflecting on some of the stories that we tell at my organization in Blue Water, Baltimore, I would say that a lot of our less edited and kind of less produced content often performs better on social media, at least organically, than say a 5-minute video that we produce with a local filmmaker. So I guess my question for you is, do you feel that smaller nonprofits can still do a pretty decent job reaching their local constituents through snippets of less edited, more raw and real footage that's promoted on, say, Instagram Reels or TikTok or something?
Yeah, absolutely. So my advice that's what you're talking about is, you're right. 5-minute long, 7-8 minute long content is too long for the internet. it's also why we like sort of look at feature-length documentaries, because we're after the people who are on Netflix versus the people who are on their phone waiting for the bus, you know, and they might be the same person, but they're in two different mind frames when we're doing one activity versus the other. However, the message needs to meet the medium. So your point is exactly right. And it is raw video, short clips, in maybe a campaign, Instagram Reels, Instagram Stories. These are very powerful places, but you can still be super inclusive of who is producing them. My best advice for you know, and I love Blue Water Baltimore, and I actually was pretty involved with you all way back when Julie Lawson was there, who's like a mentor and friend of mine. So thank you for your work anyways. You're one of my favorites in the Alliance, but, and that's only because I know you, but point being is there's so many resources we don't actually recognize are resources. Talk to the teacher who teaches audio visual at a local high school. Find the student, because you would not believe what 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids can do. Like half their life is curating their Instagram story, you know, like honestly, their editing ability, their knowing what will play with the constituent, like knowing how to create tension or interest or dialogue. It's a generation that was raised doing this. And so even us, when we're working with, like, our shooters cost us $1,500 a day to shoot. And those are the biggest, best cameras you can get. However, we are also involving the local high school or college. Like both of those places have kids who are looking for real world experience and have an incredible amount of raw talent. And that sort of community engagement gets a bunch of students, gets a bunch of teachers, gets a bunch of people involved in the production. And so that already has a multiplier effect from a distribution standpoint. And then, you know, if you do get to the place of creating a 5 to 8 minute video, where we want that to live, like our success at getting that out is by the distribution model I talked about earlier, about everybody can natively embed or use or showcase. And even that has its limits. But where it does get cool is it starts getting used by people in presentations, it starts getting used in panel discussions and things like that. So go with your instinct. I don't know how old you are, Lauren, but I can tell you're younger than me. And so you're going to be more versed and interested in these mediums. Find the kids, you know, who do this at their school, because, like, let's be honest, we've got 16-year-old kids on TikTok who have 40 million followers at this point. So, you know, that is a resource you can tap. And often people in the influencer space are looking for authentic content to build their brand. Let them hijack it. Just make sure they don't say the wrong thing.
Thanks so much, Stiv.
We have a few more minutes and we have a hand up from Chris Wilkie. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks. Thanks so much, Stiv, for this presentation and the perspective. This was really, really great, very eye-opening as well. My question relates to what you did with highlighting the local voices in Cancer Alley, but applying that to an international lens. How did you go about recruiting the participants and voices from other countries, where, you know, traveling there may not be quite as easy on a fact-finding trip and that kind of thing. And I guess I'm speaking particularly to the story of plastic, because you did a great job in that of bringing in people from the Philippines and Indonesia and that sort of thing. So what sort of outreach did you do, or did you work within a coalition? How did that work?
Yeah, so we worked within the Break Free from Plastic movement, coalition network, however you really want to define it. It's kind of a hybrid, which is largely organized by a group called Gaia, which is Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. They have a waste activist network that's global. And we were able to get to a lot of the folks we got to by leveraging that network and the leadership within that network, which already put us in the like trust position. The one funny thing is the guy in that film, Prigi Arasandi from Surabaya, Indonesia, that I just showed. He's also in the Story of Plastic. He's become like a brother of another mother to me. How I met him was at a conference in Bali, and he doesn't speak English very well, and I speak zero Bahasa other than like hello and thank you. And he just urged me. He said, "You need to come to Surabaya to see the diaper problem, Surabaya diaper problem." And we were like, "What are diapers?" And like, "Oh, diapers. Okay, diapers." And so he basically badgered us. And we said, okay, we'll go, we'll check it out. And we got on a plane, it's only like 45-minute flight from Bali to Surabaya. It's both in East Java, and got off and we went straight into a direct action with him, having no idea that we were going into a direct action, and the police were following us. And Prigi is pretty funny. He like could tell we were like very tense because we were like, we've never filmed in Indonesia before. Like, we know there are some issues here. This is supposed to be research. And he said something very funny to me. He's like, police? You worried about police? And he's like, don't worry. Our police are not like your police, which was incredibly telling, which kind of like blew my mind. That said, so it's a great story, but a poor example of how I networked that. But it was literally like, giving people the benefit of the doubt. If they say, I got a story, is following that lead. It may be fruitful, it may be not. But I know there are international water collectives too. I mean, I know that the Waterkeeper Alliance can talk to anybody working on water in Africa or South America. There are contacts that way. So it's on the pre-production standpoint, or on the pre-end, get to the place, and then get to the high level, and that high level can bring you down to the community level in most cases. I hope that was helpful, Chris. It's not a super erudite answer, but I think there's more than one way to get at this. And I was sort of giving an example of how we did.
Well, thank you so much, Stiv. Again, I think this has been a fabulous discussion, and I thank everyone for joining us here today. We will be sending out the recording in the next day or so, but if you have any follow-up questions, please send them my way, and I will work to try and get answers for you. But in the meantime, stay happy and healthy, and take care, everyone.
I have one thing to add, if I may, at the end, is when I talked about our model at the very beginning, we subsidize our own salaries to help other people produce good stories, which is an open invitation for you to give me a call, is what I'm saying. So even if you're not paying us to develop or the content or whatever, if you want to spitball with somebody on how to craft a story about a place, happy to take that call. Because to me, if I can help with that, and you're able to produce it and get it out, and it creates a change, that's incredibly satisfying for a little bit of advice and a little bit of time. So that's a resource. We exist to serve folks like you and help you answer these questions.
Wonderful. Thank you much. Thank you so much, Stiv, and thank you for the work you're doing as well.
Thank you all. Take care.